Welcome to our podcast, Oncology Morning Commute, Clinical Trials Ensuring Inclusivity. Morning Commute is developed in collaboration with At Point of Care and Projects in Knowledge and is part of a continuing medical education series. This independent CME-CE activity is supported by an educational grant from Astellas, Merck & Company, Pharmacyclics, an AbbVie company, and Janssen Biotech. In this final episode in our series, Dr. Otis Brawley and Dr. Christopher Flowers discuss clinical trials in oncology. Are they reflective of the general population of patients who will ultimately be affected by the trial outcomes? Drs. Brawley and Flowers take a deeper look at factors that impact clinical trial demographics. Information about the faculty and disclosures can be found at morningcommutepodcast.com/disparities5. You can use this link to receive your credit and evaluate this program. The URL can also be accessed in the episode notes. Dr. Brawley is a professor in the Department of Oncology at Johns Hopkins University, Baltimore, Maryland. Dr. Flowers is Division Head ad interim of the Division of Cancer Medicine and is professor and chair of lymphoma and myeloma at MD Anderson Cancer Center in Houston, Texas. I am Candace Hoffman, managing editor of Morning Commute. Dr. Brawley will begin our discussion.
Hi, this is Dr. Otis Brawley talking to Dr. Chris Flowers, and in this edition of the podcast, we're going to talk about clinical trials and the need for inclusivity and how you ensure inclusivity. Thank you for joining me, Chris.
Great, thanks, Otis.
Yeah, Chris, the NIH Revitalization Act of 1993 put a broad light on the issue of inclusion by race and gender in clinical trials. What do you think about that? And do you think we overemphasize it, underemphasize it, or is it just right? Or is it not important at all?
Yeah, in my view, this is just right. I think that it is really important that our clinical trials, particularly our clinical trials that are designed to change the practice of clinical care, reflect the population of patients for whom those decisions are ultimately going to be applied. And so we really need to have inclusion of the appropriate patient populations by race, by gender, and ideally by some other factors like socioeconomic status, rural status, some of the other factors that we talked about in the other podcasts that influence the social determinants of health that can influence outcomes. If we really want to see interventions change practice and change practice in ways that impacts all patients, we need to enroll the kinds of patients that it will ultimately be applied to on clinical trials.
Yeah, you bring up a good point. Race is not a biological categorization, it's a socio-political categorization. And many of the clinical trials that are out there, though, especially the large ones, we have what's called the healthy volunteer effect, where when we look at the outcome of a drug treatment or a surgery or what have you, it's much better in the clinical trial than when we go do it in the real world, because the people who were attracted to the clinical trial because they had transportation, they had insurance, they actually fulfill the inclusion criteria for the clinical trial, they tend to be healthier as a group than folks in the real world. And so inclusion is important if you want to get a real answer for how the treatment or how the preventative is going to work in the entire population. Now, it's interesting, we were reviewing some data before the podcast. NCI sponsored clinical trials through the National Cancer Institute sponsored clinical trials through the cooperative groups tend to be representative of the populations of the United States by race. I'm using race as a socio-political categorization. Company-sponsored trials tend to have lower numbers of Blacks and lower numbers of Hispanics. You want to speculate on why that might be?
It's hard to know exactly what the reasons for those differences are, but I suspect that relates to the types of sites where those clinical trials are open. Those tend not to be sites in less urban populations. The NCI groups have a little bit of a broader reach in that there are components of the NCI compendium of sites that include less urban centers and also include cooperation with community-based practices. And so that may be more reflective of the US populations. I think that companies, particularly companies that are moving towards attempts at new drug approvals, are aware of these distinctions in terms of the lack of representation that they might have for certain groups, and are now actively trying to make changes to be able to improve that. But that's something that we need to see with additional interventions in the future, like some of the ones that we'll talk about to improve inclusivity and enrollment on clinical trials.
Are Blacks and Hispanics and Native Americans unwilling to go on to clinical trials?
So I think one of the things that has been raised that can be addressed with data is that when clinical trial participation is offered to patients, and this gets back to some of the points we talked about in the earlier podcast about equal access leads to equal outcomes. When Blacks and whites and Hispanics are asked to enroll in clinical trials, they commonly participate at the same kinds of rates that white patients do.
The National Cancer Institute, the NCI, was a leader in this. They started doing these studies back in the mid-1990s, and it's been done several times now. And when you talk to people who qualify for a treatment study in cancer, 70 to 75%, 70 to 77% really, say yes, be they Black, white, Hispanic, or other races and ethnicities. It's amazing. Now that's trials for people who have cancer. There are some disparities in some of the trials where you're trying to prevent disease. And there, when you start thinking about it, and when you talk about breast cancer prevention trial or prostate cancer prevention trial, you're asking someone to enter a trial for 5 to 10 years and take a pill every day to try to prevent a problem that they're not likely to have. You have to be educated and upper middle class to be able to afford to worry about a problem that you're not likely to have. It's interesting.
It is interesting. I mean, I think there are a number of barriers to clinical trial participation. As you mentioned, when individuals are asked to participate, the rates don't appear to differ quite dramatically, at least using race as one factor in a social construct that we can use to look at that. I think, but there are clearly barriers. Travel is one of them that can influence that. Health literacy and health education are other ones. Those are barriers that can be addressed by some of the factors that we described in our previous podcast, like patient navigators, support from other components of the healthcare system, like advanced practice providers and specific clinical trial coordinators that help to promote enrollment on clinical trials.
Now, we of course want clinical trials to be safe, and that's why we have eligibility criteria. But some of those eligibility criteria keep minorities off of trials because the minority community, the racial minority community, does have, for socioeconomic and social determinants of health reasons, higher rates of comorbidity, higher rates of cardiovascular disease, diabetes, hypertension, obesity. Are you aware of efforts to try to decrease the eligibility criteria but keep these trials safe?
So this has been an area that's been a personal interest and something that I've been focused on in recent years around clinical trials in general. I think many of our eligibility criteria are legacy or historical eligibility criteria. Some of those come about because clinical trials go through phases, and in phase 1 and phase 2, when we're first testing the safety of the new drug, we oftentimes restrict the drug to more select patient populations to be able to test its safety. Once that safety is proven, though, it's possible to remove potentially some of those eligibility criteria. In situations when those eligibility criteria are needed and absolutely necessary for the safety of a drug, where we know that a drug might affect blood pressure, hypertension is one example that might be relevant. But in others where hypertension or diabetes or obesity are not really strictly relevant to the mechanism of the action of the drug or the potential safety of the drug, those kinds of criteria really need to be removed to expand the opportunities for eligibility for broader patient populations and to ease the process of getting patients on clinical trials. In some cases, the pages and pages or reams of eligibility criteria that you need to go through to determine whether somebody's eligible or not by themselves are a barrier to participation in the clinical trial.
Yeah, one of the reasons why I've always encouraged people to participate in clinical trials, or at least go to doctors who participate in clinical trials, is going way, way back into the early 1990s. There's a couple guys named Arnie Kaluzny and Dick Wernicke from the University of North Carolina and the University of Illinois. And they did a series of studies to show that doctors who participate in clinical trials, be they in the community or at universities, doctors who participate in clinical trials take better care of all of their patients. If they put 3% of their patients on clinical trials, they took better care of the other 97%. The treatment was more likely to be up to date. Something about the discipline and the learning of participating in clinical trials affects how they take care of all their patients. I think that's underrated in our literature. People don't understand that is a legitimate reason to support clinical trials. It improves quality of care. I don't know what you think of that.
Yeah, that is really a very important point. I mean, the kind of scrutiny that it takes to be able to put a patient on a clinical trial in terms of going through each of those kinds of eligibility criteria that I described, collecting labs in a timely fashion to determine eligibility and to be able to follow the patient on the trial, giving medications and treatments at a prescribed timeline and documenting that very carefully. All of those skills that the physicians develop in the process of caring for patients on clinical trial naturally translate into their care of other patients. And so for those reasons, going to see a doctor who participates in clinical trials can provide a higher quality cancer care than other settings.
Last question. Going into the future, we're going to see a lot more 30 and 50-person trials that are looking at a drug and a target, or a drug that's metabolized to something that hits a target. We're going to have to look more at pharmacokinetics and the pharmacology of drugs and the distribution of these targets and these metabolic enzymes in various populations, by populations defined by area of geographic origin versus race. Am I right?
I think that's exactly right. We've started in my research group to look at ethnic origin and to see how ethnic origin influences variability in things like the tumor, but likewise it influences the metabolism of the drug pharmacokinetics, and potentially responses to the drug therapy in terms of the outcomes with the tumor, but also the toxicity of the drugs. And so we'll need to look at that much more closely.
This has been Otis Brawley talking to Dr. Chris Flowers, discussing clinical trials and ensuring inclusivity. Thank you for listening to the podcast.
Thank you for joining us today. Remember, to receive your credit and evaluate this program, please visit morningcommutepodcast.com/disparities5. For all the episodes in this series, please visit morningcommutepodcast.com/disparities.